There are surveys on your table for some feedback at the end, so if you don't mind filling those out, they help us with funding. And I'll pass this over to Dr. Megan Arlett, who is from the UK and an assistant professor here for creative writing.
I'm kind of a long room, so if you're having trouble hearing me at the moment, my voice doesn't travel great, so you can just like that, and I'll see, and I'll try and speak louder. So I want to say thank you for joining me here this afternoon. I was fully anticipating it being just me and Salma. I'm going to be talking to you about the art of writing from global perspectives. As you saw in the advertising spiel, we often reflect on the places we have been and where we want to go. And the act of travel, I think, teaches us just as much about ourselves as it does about other people and other cultures and other places. And I think this act of learning can be demonstrated throughout multiple genres, like fiction, poetry, nonfiction, screenwriting, playwriting. Today I'm going to focus in on two genres, my two primary genres, which are creative nonfiction and poetry. I'll talk for 30, 40 minutes maybe, but we'll almost definitely have time for questions at the end. So I'm going to begin just talking a little bit about my journey into travel writing. I'll walk us through some examples, and then I'll spit us out the other side with some reader recommendations. Okay? By most definitions of human aesthetic, the landscape of South Louisiana is ugly. There are no mountains, no crystal clear lakes. The waters making their way down the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico are muddy, brown, filled with silt and bottom-feeding creatures. The grass is razor sharp. The ants bite. Cockroaches the size of a palm fly at you. Spindling towers of oil refineries break the horizon. When I first came to the United States, the week after I turned 20, my first long-haul flight on my first wide-body plane, leaving Europe for the first time, and that first day, circling South Louisiana as we approached Baton Rouge Airport, I was surprised by how green the landscape below me was. It had never occurred to me that Louisiana would be green. Until that point in my life, heat had always been a really dry thing. The landscape of my childhood was mild and damp. It was England. The landscape of my adolescence had been hot and dry. Yellow grasses on yellow hillsides, golden dirt all the way to golden sand on the beach in southern Spain. Logic followed that this new hot place, only 6 degrees further south than where I'd grown up in Andalusia, would be the same. So that first night, having left my single suitcase, all I had brought with me, in a room empty of everything except bedsheets and a pillow, I walked outside into a rainstorm so violent, I watched as the storm drains nearby overflowed within minutes. Beside me, another British foreign exchange student stood drenched in the rain. We looked at each other. We reached our hands out and turned our palms toward the sky and laughed maniacally. We had never seen rain like it in our lives. And amidst my culture shock, I started to write. I wrote about my first overwhelming steps into a Bass Pro. I wrote about Walmart and Hooters and Mardi Gras and andouille sausage. There was so much to notice about where I was, and through the noticing, the ability to reflect on myself and where I had come from. After all, I wouldn't be noticing these things in this way if I were from here. And I wrote these musings down in personal essays and poems. Travel writing finds its roots as early as you'd expect in human history. As long as humans have been wandering around, we've been telling stories about it. Herodotus wrote the histories after traveling the Eastern Mediterranean between 450 and 420 BC. Julius Caesar wrote Commentari di Bello Gallico about his journey during the Gallic Wars. Homer's The Odyssey from 8 BC is essentially a travelogue recounting Odysseus' journey home after the fall of Troy. In the 17th century, Japanese poet Matsuo Basho wrote The Narrow Road to the Deep North, which is Oku no Hosomitsuchi in Japanese. Here he is, he's hanging out under a tree, he's having a good time. It's a classic of Japanese literature from the Edo period, and it's essentially a diary of the poet's travels as he walked around Japan. And is written in a form called a haibun, which is spelled Haibun. It's a combination of a short prose entry, a little diary entry, followed by a haiku. So the example we have here is, I went to see the Atsuta shrine, but it had been reduced to utter ruins. Walls had crumbled, and dried grasses were standing among the fallen blocks. There were ropes here and there, showing the sites of the extinct shrines, and stones engraved the names of the gods once enshrined therein. A shot of brown sagebrush and overgrown reminiscence gave me an impression not altogether pleasing, but strangely lasting. Even the weedy reminiscences are dead. I bought and ate some rice cakes at an inn. What I love about this example here is its demonstration that a piece needn't be expansive to give us depth and revelation. The prose section commits itself to description, and then Basho uses the haiku to give some insight into his personal feelings or what he has seen and done that day. It's a simple form, but effectiveness comes through that simplicity. And the text is still so influential that many people go on pilgrimages and they follow his path, and there's just this sort of this connection through time and space that is ongoing through this. Right? I think it says something about how we desire to connect people through landscapes and experiences. If we fast forward about 250 years, we arrive in 1938. We find the poet Elizabeth Bishop. Here she is. She loves cats. There are lots of pictures of Elizabeth Bishop and cats. She also loved to paint, so this is an Elizabeth Bishop painting of Brazil. So it's 1938, and Bishop is traveling from Key West to Brazil. It's the first leg of this planned world trip that she's going to go on. She ends up actually just staying in Brazil for 14 years. She gets there and she's like, this place is nice, I'm staying. And the book she wrote during her time there was called Questions of Travel. And it opens with this poem, Arrival at Santos, which is perfectly off-center. Here is a coast, here is a harbor. Here, after a meager diet of horizon, is some scenery, impractically shaped in, who knows, self-pitying mountains, sad and harsh beneath their frivolous greenery, with a little church on top of one, and warehouses, some of them painted a feeble pink or blue, and some tall, uncertain palms. Oh, tourist, is this how this country is going to answer you and your immodest demands for a different world and a better life, and complete comprehension of both at last and immediately, after 18 days of suspension? Finish your breakfast. The tender is coming, a strange and ancient craft, flying a strange and brilliant rag. So that's the flag. I never saw it before. Somehow never thought of there being a flag. But of course there was all along, and coins, I presume, and paper money, they remain to be seen. And gingerly now we climb down the ladder backward, myself and a fellow passenger named Miss Breen, descending into the midst of 26 freighters waiting to be loaded with green coffee beans. Please, boy, do be more careful with that boat hook. Watch out. Oh, it has caught Miss Breen's skirt. There. Miss Breen is about 70, a retired police lieutenant, 6 feet tall, with beautiful bright blue eyes and a kind expression. Her home, when she is at home, is in Glens Falls, New York. There. We are settled. The customs officials will speak English, we hope, and leave us our bourbon and cigarettes, ports and necessities, like postage stamps or soap. But they seldom seem to care what impression they make, or, like this, only attempt, since it does not matter. The unassertive colors of soap or postage stamps, wasting away like the former, slipping the way the latter do when we mail the letters we wrote on the boat. Either because the glue here is very inferior, or because of the heat. We leave Santos at once. We are driving to the interior. I adore Elizabeth Bishop, I adore this poem. I think she is a really exuberant and humorous poet. A lot of time I think we come to poetry expecting it to be morose and sad, which it can be a lot of the time. And Elizabeth Bishop doesn't step away from that. but she also lets you know that she's a human being with a personality, right? So if you're sitting there and you're thinking, like, what is this poem about? I mean, she tells you. She tells us in the title, we're arriving at Santos, right? And it's just a simple narrative about getting to Brazil and getting off the boat. Yeah. I love the joke in the first 2 lines. Here is a coast, here is a harbor, here, after a meager diet of horizon is some scenery, right? Like, they haven't had much to eat in terms of things to look at, they've just had to see. She has this really subtle rhyme scheme running through it. Scenery, greenery, blue, view, comprehension, suspension, rag, flag, right? But she writes this so effortlessly that you don't necessarily notice it until you start looking for it. And then she starts asking ethical questions of the traveler, right? Where is it? Oh, tourist, is this how this country is going to answer you and your immodest demands for a different world and a better life and complete comprehension of both at last and immediately, right? She's speaking to herself, she's speaking to these other travelers, she's saying, like, do you really think that arriving here is going to change your view on the world? Like, you're asking so much, this is just a place, right? So that question, those ethical questions, are much more present in contemporary creative nonfiction and poetry, but we start to see them in Elizabeth's early work, right, in Bishop's early work. At this point in time, we're starting to ask more critical questions about the author's role in telling stories about other places and other people. And we've learned that it's a little bit icky to go somewhere and look at other people's poverty or misfortune and then announce how changed you are by the experience of recognizing how lucky you are. So when Bishop arrives in Brazil, she's aware of this, right? The you is both subconscious and the imagined expectations of other travelers. Even though this is present in this first poem of hers, she still ends up writing poems that I think we would now see as a little problematic, right? She's being journalistic, she has a poem called Squatters' Children, right? So she's still in those early days of resisting the urge to self-reflect during travel, right? So around 10 years after Bishop arrived in Brazil, in 1948, James Baldwin moved from New York to Paris. When asked why he had chosen France, he replied, it wasn't so much a matter of choosing France, it was a matter of getting out of America. So Baldwin, he didn't leave racism behind in America. Instead, in Paris, he experienced race and class differently. In Notes from a Native Son, he shared how poor expats, Africans, and students in the Latin Quarter lived in what he called ageless, sinister-looking hotels, and were forced to continually choose between cigarettes and cheese for lunch. And in the essay Encounter on the Seine, he states that the American Negro in Paris is very nearly the invisible man. He writes that he was ignored not just by the French, but by Americans in Paris. He found that white Americans simply didn't expect to see black people in Paris or Europe. It hadn't occurred to them, right? And it was in Paris that he completed much of the work on Go Tell It on the Mountain and Giovannis Room. Giovannis Room is phenomenal, if you don't know what to read tonight. The first novel, set in Harlem, and the second, about a queer man's experiences in Paris, show us how travel's inspirations are not limited to presenting themselves in our work, but sometimes what travel does is give us the space to look back at where we have come from, see it more clearly, render it, and then also put its critiques on the page. So, for white Western writers, much of the problem with contemporary travel writing is the degree to which it risks white saviorism. A poet like Carolyn Poche offers a really great perspective on how the writer abroad can offer political commentary that doesn't center the self, and doesn't position the Western outsider as a hero who can solve all these problems and has all the answers. Her 1981 collection, The Country Between Us, she traveled to El Salvador in the midst of the Civil War. And her most famous poem from this collection is called The Colonel. What What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its blackboard over the house. On the television, it was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows, there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner. Rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach hearts. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive then. "I'm tired of fooling around," he said. "As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves." He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. "Something for your poetry, no?" he said. Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground. So what we see here is pure observation, right? She's there, she's in El Salvador, she's witnessing this. But Forché refuses to use this moment as an opportunity to reflect on the self, because it simply isn't about the self. It is about something so much bigger. The only ethical way for her to engage with this moment is to do so with the detachment of a journalist. It is not for her, an American outsider, to extol and critique this moment, though her imagery and description tell us how she feels about this experience. In the collection of the whole, as a whole, she moves from El Salvador, she goes to Europe, she's in Eastern Europe for a while. The reflection occurs when the poet returns to the US. In one of her poems, she says, "I tell you, I have not rested. Not since I drove those streets with a gun in my lap. Not since all manner of speaking has failed, and the remnant of my life continues onward. I go mad, for example, in the Safeway, at the many heads of lettuce, papayas and sugar, pineapples and coffee, especially the coffee. And when I speak with American men, there is an absence of recognition. Their constant scotch and fine white hands, many hours of businesses, motor inns, and women with faint resemblances to their wives." Her reflection looks both at the excessive abundance of America, but also the shallowness with which it is appreciated. This is not a poem that says, "Look at how lucky we are." Instead, it rails at the lack of recognition in those around her. It is a critique. After returning to the US, Forché wrote up evidence of what she had witnessed in El Salvador, and she traveled the country educating Americans about the consequences of interventionism. A fun fact, a not very fun fact, is that at some points in the 1980s, the aid that the US was sending to El Salvador, which mostly ended up in the wrong hands, was about $1 million a day. Right? So she's traveling the country, she's critiquing this, she is trying to educate people at home. Her poetry and her prose became activism and political critique rather than sermonizing for. She didn't release, she has a companion prose memoir about this time until 2019. What you have heard is true, is taken as a line from that famous poem. Though she wrote both texts simultaneously. And about this, she has said, quote, "Part of my soul went into my memoir, and another part went into the poetry book. In the memoir, I was reliving a past self. I was inhabiting the woman I once was. In the poetry book, I'm the woman I am now. And what I see here is the fact that a writer can revisit or rewrite the same period of their lives over and over again in different forms, with different contemplations and different focuses. And I think the takeaway is that we don't have only one shot to tell a story or to reflect on how something has impacted us. So, having looked at these examples of writers who have used their travel experience in their work, how do we use this to inform our own work and our own writing? For me, that question of what to write about is less interesting than asking how we write about it and the ethical concerns while doing so. So we can write poems, we can write personal essays, we can write lyric essays, we can write memoir, we can write biographies, autobiographies, but what's the point in doing so if we don't do it thoughtfully? When I write about living and experiencing Eastern New Mexico, I need to be wary not to perpetuate stereotypes that might be harmful to our community, to observe without judgment, to describe accurately. It is also my duty to inform myself on how history and politics have shaped this region, so that when I see and note something, I can point to a systemic reason behind it, rather than falling back into the easy response of, well, that's not how we do it where I'm from. And some of you in this room might have been born here. You might have lived here your whole life. Some of you might have lived here for most of your life. And if that's you and you're thinking, well, I've never been to Japan, I've never been to El Salvador or Brazil or France, what am I supposed to write about? I want to assure you that you still have the story to tell that is informed by the world at large. Here in Eastern New Mexico, we live in the US, we live in the United States. But we're the only state that specifies this on our license plates, because so many people forget this fact. Many of our friends, peers, and colleagues speak Spanish, often interchangeably with English. This was also an experience that I had as a teenager in Spain, amongst an expat community. We live in New Mexico, but the landscape often feels like we're an extension of West Texas. So a global perspective, for me, doesn't start at some arbitrary made-up line on a map. For most of us, it's already here. So I think we all have a story to tell. We just have to figure out the best vessel to tell it. So I wanted us to look at some really contemporary texts that might help inform or inspire you in your reading or writing journey. You know, maybe a Japanese poet from the 17th century doesn't call to you or your experience in the world. Although Basho, some of the things that annoy him feel very contemporary. He has some great haiku about how annoying mosquitoes are, and how he doesn't feel like he can kill them because he's Buddhist. Okay, we've got Shu, Stay True, winner of the Pulitzer Prize. This is, the author is Taiwanese American. It's his memoir of growing up, of being first generation. He has this close friendship with another young man who is just exemplifying all of the things that he feels he can't do. And then his friend, very early in their friendship, dies. And so it's about grief, right? It's about grief, friendship, coming of age, all of these things. Kazim Ali's Bright Felon. This is a really highly experimental memoir. I don't think it can really be categorized by genre. It's doing things in poetry, it's doing things in prose. It's described as part detective story, part literary memoir, part imagined past. So if you want to read a book that makes you have weird feelings about what books are, I think that's a good one to go for. A coastline is an immeasurable thing. Mary Alice Daniel, she's born in Nigeria, she grew up in the UK, and then she moved to the US as a young adult. Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis. This is actually a graphic memoir. It's awesome. It's actually in 4 parts. It's about growing up in Tehran amidst the Iranian Revolution. She moves to Vienna in her early teens. And then, I think as an adult, she moved to France. She lives in Paris now. It's just it's a really great graphic memoir. Graphic memoirs in general, I'm a big fan of. The Traces is a book about the author moving to Italy as a young adult, and she's obsessed with Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. So it's a meditation. It's a little cerebral. It's a little in her own head, but the vibes are really good. The vibes are very Italy. And Megan Harlan's Mobile Home. So Megan Harlan, due to her father's job, she ended up living in 17 places across 4 continents growing up, and they would often just move. You know, they'd find out that her father was getting a new job, and a month later they'd be living in a double wide in Alaska, and then 9 months later they're in a luxury apartment in, Tunisia, right? It's a really interesting perspective. And truly, this list could be 10 times this length and still barely touch on all the books and perspectives that are out there. These are just really a combination of books I have read recently that I liked, and books that I think that you should read. Right. Okay. Thank you for being here and listening. I would love to answer any questions you have about writing and books and everything.
Okay, good.
You want to tell a little bit your experience in Andalusia? Because from England to Andalusia, they're, not that far away, but they're 2 different worlds.
Yeah, so when I was 10, I think my parents were about to get divorced, and they were like, we're gonna move to Spain, it's gonna save our marriage. So they did. So we moved to Spain when I was 11. And the south of Spain is a really interesting microcosm of human culture, because a lot of people live there in expat communities. So you can live in southern Spain and work in English, and everyone you speak to is English, and go to school in English, and never really have any need for Spanish. So when we moved there, I was in Spanish school for a couple of years, but there were so many English children in the Spanish school that the teachers, honestly, they were just over it. So a lot of the time, the English kids were just left to our own devices, or we would get put in a special room to learn Spanish, but we didn't just speak English. And then I was in international school for a little while, and then I moved back to England when I started college. So yeah, it's a strange place. It's also, Andalusia's nickname is called Costa del Crime. In the 70s and 80s, a lot of criminals from the UK moved to South Spain because they didn't have an extradition treaty. So a lot of people who were selling drugs or wanted for murder moved to southern Spain and then just started again there. So yeah. The mayor of the city that we lived in while we were there was arrested, and they found 2 million euros in cash in his mattress. What a place.
Yeah, I love nonfiction, and I'm amused by this, what seems to be a newish term, creative nonfiction. Isn't creative nonfiction just good nonfiction?
So I think, it does sound like an oxymoron, right? But I think that there's a difference between the biography of Abraham Lincoln that someone forces you to read and books that use fictional and poetic techniques to really spin a story that keeps you engaged beyond just the A to B narrative of it. I think that that's what differentiates it. And particularly in contemporary forms, you can get really experimental and really creative in these realms that are really, I see them as you've got nonfiction here and you've got poetry here, and there's this whole world in the middle that is making leaps and doing a lot of interesting things with energy and language. And once you start to read those books, you realize how much possibility there is in telling a story.
Were you always writing, or was there a certain
you started?
I'm one of those super obnoxious people that always knew what they wanted to do. So, yeah, I can't be like, oh, I went to this talk when I was 14 and then I knew. I mean, I knew from like age 4. It's on like a piece of homework that I did when I was 4. Sorry. There was no aha moment.
What do you recommend for when someone has writer's block?
I agree that writer's block exists, but I think that we have this idea that the muse will just arrive, right? And you will just know what to write about. But the muse, I think, has to find you working. So sometimes you really just have to be a horrible person to yourself, and you just have to sit down and you have to bully yourself. You're like, I'm going to write 750 words, and it might be the worst 750 words you've ever written, but you have to get through the worst to get to the good stuff, right? The good stuff's not going to arrive until you get out all of the bad stuff. Yeah, and it's true of any kind of writing.
Do you have any advice for publishing your first work or anything like that?
You're gonna cry. It's really hard. Are you talking at like the small like publishing literary magazines, or are you talking about publishing full-length collections?
I'm specifically talking about like novels, full-length collections, stuff like that.
So it depends on the genre. For novels, you write the whole thing, and then you write up a little pitch and you send out to agents. And if they like your pitch and your first maybe 2 chapters they'll ask to see the full thing. And they'll read the full thing, and then they'll be like, yes, I love this, I'm going to represent you. Or they say no and you keep trying, right? And that process can take a really long time. I would say, like, would you say, 100 agents is not an unheard of amount to query?
Yeah, I mean, you do it in blocks, right? You do a group, and then you get some feedback sometimes, and you have to incorporate that feedback. So I wouldn't just carpet bomb. But there's resources, like there's Poets and Writers Journal, which is online with pw.org. It's worth looking at, and it has like a bunch of tips about how to query. And there's also independent presses that you don't need agents for. It depends on what genre you're writing in. Like literary fiction or creative nonfiction, you may want to go independent presses.
And if you're at that stage, you have a whole English department
Yeah,
here at Eastern, where you can just come hang out and ask us questions. And then, if you get an agent, then they try and sell it. It's a long, long process. Yeah, it's slightly different for nonfiction. You can either go that route, or sometimes, if you're established or if you have a good enough publications, you can write an outline of the book you want to write. That's a little rarer. And then poetry is a whole different beast. It's honestly a hellscape. You send out to contests and it's awful. That's a quick summary. So it's a little negative, but sometimes you get good news. If you want to send excerpts to literary magazines, there are so many different magazines, there's hundreds, right? And some they'll accept 1% of their submissions, some accept more, and that's a good way to get your foot in the door and get used to like the ebb and flow of writing land. I have a whole PowerPoint on it if you want me to send it to you.
That would be awesome.
Any other questions?
Just while the students are thinking of that next great question, what part of England are you from?
I'm from an hour south of London.
Okay,
Yeah.
south of England then.
Yeah.
So, and I'm just amused by this flag because it's 3 different flags. So
Yeah,
and
they didn't put Wales in there at all.
right, yeah, they were overrun too soon, right? But so my question is, from a global perspective, do you identify as Londoner, English, or British? This vague word. How do you identify
I would
internationally?
use the word British.
Yeah.
Yeah. Half of my family is from Wales and half is from England, so British for me encompasses that. but I did not know the difference between Great Britain, the British Isles, and all of that until I was well into my teens. It's very confusing. So if you don't know the difference, I wouldn't worry about it. Some people don't even know Wales exists. So.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Arlett, for coming in. I found this presentation so we just wanted to give you a little gift from the multicultural department, which is a multicultural portfolio.
Thank you.
Also, a couple other things before I let you guys go. So our next event is coming up. It's on the 17th. It's on your desk. It is my henna art event where I'm going to be doing authentic Arabic henna. So I'd love for you guys to stop by at the multicultural department. We'll also have Aladdin playing, and you guys can have popcorn as a snack. So yeah, please do stop by for that. Also, be on the lookout of all of the events during Hispanic Heritage Month. Those calendars are also on your desk. There are some interesting events also to do with food, so you know you're gonna see me there. So yeah, if you have any ideas for events, please do write them down on our surveys that are placed on your tables. And can I get one more round of applause for Dr.